What's up everyone? Janitor Jake here. Now see, for my fans out there, and those who are familiar with me and my channel, already know that I am a fan of the vampire movie franchise of The Lost Boys. The first movie, The Lost Boys, I thought was awesome. However, the second movie, Lost Boys the Tribe, I thought was a pretty crumbtastic sequel, and basically just a terrible, terrible remake of the first film. And then there is Lost Boys The Thirst, which I thought was way better than the second film, but definitely not as good as the first film. Now see, in 2008, when I reviewed Lost Boys and Lost Boys The Tribe, I heard some random jibber-jabber off in the distance about there being a comic book series based off of the Lost Boys franchise. However, I was never able to actually get my hands on those comics. Until now. So, whatever. Enough rambling and babbling and running off at the mouth. Let's get to my review of Lost Boys Reign of Frogs. Lost Boys Reign of Frogs was a comic book miniseries that came out in 2008 and only consisted of 4 issues. The story itself takes place between the end of The Lost Boys and beginning of Lost Boys The Tribe, to help bridge the 21-year gap between the two films. So in Reign of Frogs, issue number 1, the basic storyline revolves around Edgar Frog, who now lives in Luna Bay, California in the year 2007 as a surfboard shaper. Out of the blue, some random kid shows up at his place and tells Edgar that he wants to be his apprentice. Edgar, of course, doesn't trust anyone and does a vampire test on the kid with crosses and holy water, but the kid ends up passing. So Edgar tries talking the kid out of being a vampire hunter, but when the kid hears this, he tells Edgar that he will just go and find Alan, who is Edgar's brother, and just have Alan teach him. In which case, Edgar gets angry and tells the kid to sit down, shut up, and listen, and then proceeds to tell a story. We are now brought back to the year of 1990, which now takes place in Washington, D.C., where we see Edgar and Alan fighting some vampires who happen to be United States senators and other politicians. And as it turns out, Edgar and Alan were hired to kill the vampire politicians by the President of the United States. Now see, some people out there might think that the whole vampire politician thing is pretty stupid. However, it actually flows very nicely into the next part, which I think is pretty cool. Edgar starts talking about how the Revolutionary War was basically about vampires, how that most normal people wanted to come to the colonies because England was overrun with vampires, and even saying that people like Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Lincoln were in fact vampire hunters. You know, that gets me to wondering, did the author of the book Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter get his idea from this comic book? Oh. Anyway, Edgar and Alan decide to head back to Santa Carla after the business in Washington, D.C., and as they head back to the good old comic book shop to spend some time with their parents, someone shows up and welcomes them back. So in a nutshell, that was Lost Boys Reign of Frogs, issue number 1. Pretty good comic, I definitely will say. Now it is really awesome that after all these years, I was finally able to get my hands on the comics and see a story that takes place right after the events of the first film. And the story flows along very nicely with the events from the film, and it also takes place in the same universe. Wow! Who would have thought that would have been a good idea, to actually have it take place in the same universe? Great idea. I really appreciate that they actually did that. So thank you very much. Now, of course, we are not done yet. You still have to find out who the vampire was at the end of issue number 1. So without further ado, let's check out Lost Boys Reign of Frogs, issue number 2. So as it turns out, the vampire that shows up to welcome back the Frog Brothers is none other than David, the main vampire from the first film. Now the thing is, he apparently died at the end of the first film. I mean, we see Michael, who is one of the main characters, take David and slam him into a pair of antlers and watch David die. But here in issue number 2, David says that the antlers missed his heart. And then I start to realize that we never do get to see David actually die a normal vampire death, such as blowing up or anything like that, which adds to the continuity. So Edgar and Alan attack David and the other vampires. During the fight, the vampires get the upper hand, and when it looks like Edgar and Alan are about done for, all of a sudden, whack! One of the vamps get nailed right in the skull with an arrow. And who shot the arrow? Well, none other than Sam Emerson. And Nanook shows up as well, which is pretty awesome. So Sam and the Frog Brothers end up killing all the vampires except for David, who ends up escaping, of course. Now you remember Grandpa from the first film, right? He was pretty cool and one of my favorite characters. So I think it's really awesome when Sam and the Frog Brothers end up going back to Grandpa's house. So in the house, Edgar and Alan decide to go snooping through Grandpa's fridge looking for some food and stuff to drink. Which of course, if you remember in the first film, Grandpa did not want anyone touching anything on his shelf.
Nobody touches the second shelf but me.
As Edgar and Alan start chowing down on Grandpa's double-thick Oreo cookies, they realize everything they pull out is old and expired. The Oreos expired back in 1984, so they start digging around more and start to come to a conclusion. They think that Grandpa is a vampire, and not just any vampire, but the head vampire. Of course, Sam doesn't believe any of that, and luckily for Sam, Grandpa shows up. So Sam tells Grandpa to tell the Frog Brothers that, he isn't a vampire. And Grandpa says that he would love to, but then he would be lying. Alright, hold the phone here. The thing is, I really don't like the idea of Grandpa being a vampire. I always thought it would be cool if Grandpa was a slayer. And even in the comic books, Sam says something like, well, maybe Grandpa's a slayer. That's something I personally would have enjoyed. Now, as for issue number 2 itself, I think that it's a great comic book. They really brought in a lot of elements from the first film, which I think is awesome. And the cool thing about Grandpa being a vampire is that you can now notice it in the first film. The dead animals in the taxidermy, the root beer bottles possibly being filled with blood, and Grandpa never goes outside unless it's nighttime. And even if he does go outside during the day, he is always wearing his sunglasses, which really gives the notion that he is a half vampire. Kind of like Alan in Lost Boys: The Thirst. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. So, whatever. Without further ado, let's check out Lost Boys: Reign of Frogs, issue number 3. So Grandpa explains to everyone that he is only a half vampire. And to keep from turning into a full vampire and feeding on people, he feeds on animals, which he ends up using the bones and furs for his taxidermy work. So when the Frog Brothers ask where the head vampire is so they can kill him, Grandpa says that the head vampire is not a he. And Sam quickly realizes who it is, and it's none other than the Widow Johnson. The Widow Johnson was only talked about in the first film, and she seemed to be a love interest to Grandpa. In the comics, she's not only known as the Widow Johnson, but also as the Black Widow of Santa Carla. So Grandpa, Sam, and the Frog Brothers decide to go kill her, and her nest is, of course, in a bordello. So Grandpa gets in because everyone knows him, and he ends up sneaking Sam and the Frog Brothers inside. So they all get down to the dungeon where the Widow Johnson is supposed to be. And when they bust in, standing in front of them is a horde of female vampires, which is actually really cool, because the original sequel to The Lost Boys was supposed to be The Lost Girls, which of course would be female vampires. And this scene is cool because it seems like it's paying homage to that idea. So now we have Grandpa, Sam, and the Frog Brothers fight off vampires together, which is pretty awesome. However, during the chaos, Alan gets captured and no one notices. It isn't until Edgar gets done shooting up a bunch of vampires and turns around to address Alan that he notices that Alan is captured. So with a bunch of super speed, Edgar throws a spiked cross right into the head of the vampire and frees Alan. So he tells Alan to take it easy and it's going to be okay. But Alan says it's not, and the reason being? She made him drink, and he kinda liked it. Alright, we're getting right down to the nitty-gritty, and only one comic remains. Now, I really enjoyed the third issue quite a bit. I think it is awesome that they have Grandpa in here. And not only that, but Grandpa is fighting vampires alongside Sam and the Frog Brothers, which I think is amazing. Now, another thing that's really cool is the amount of female vampires they have in here, which they might actually be paying homage to the original idea for a sequel to the first Lost Boys film, which would have been called The Lost Girls. And also having the Widow Johnson in here is so awesome to finally be able to see. That is great. Now, one thing I wanted to mention real quick is that the female vampires are in a bordello. Now, there is a Tales from the Crypt movie called Bordello of Blood, which is basically about a bunch of female vampires living in a bordello. Now, Corey Feldman, who played Edgar Frog in the Lost Boys films, also played a main character in the film Bordello of Blood. So I get to wondering, did the comic books actually do that to pay homage to the Tales from the Crypt movie Bordello of Blood? If they did, I think that is awesome. So, whatever. Like I said, we are getting right down to the nitty-gritty, and only one more comic remains. So without further ado, let's check out Lost Boys, Reign of Frogs, issue number 4 out of 4. So they all agree that the only way to turn Ellen back to normal is to kill the Widow Johnson. So when they storm into the throne room to kill her, they see that she's a big, gigantic beast of a vampire. And as Grandpa turns to push Sam out of the way, we have a sad, tragic moment happen. Grandpa gets impaled by the Widow Johnson and ends up passing away.
I will remember you.
So now we're getting ready for a big, epic fight, but that doesn't happen. Edgar ends up going nuts and destroys her in a heartbeat. And as Edgar and Sam look around, they realize that Alan is gone. So then it cuts back to Luna Bay in the year 2007 where Edgar was talking to the kid. Because it's getting late out, Edgar decides to give the kid a ride home, and as he drops off the kid, he starts talking to him again. And out of the shadows, a vampire appears and grabs Edgar and tells him that David wants to know where Michael and Star are. So anywho, the kid ends up jumping into the mix and kills the vampire. And this next part really disappointed me. The kid ends up yelling at Edgar, telling him that he doesn't seem like an awesome, tough vampire slayer. And Edgar Frog basically tells the kid that everything was exaggerated. When they went to the bordello, it was actually during the day, and most of the vampires were in their coffins. He wasn't even sure if the senators and stuff were vampires. And the Van Helsing Medal of Valor that he got for killing vampires from the president was actually bought from Hot Topic, and the clerk was wearing a George Bush mask. But the kid decides to join him anyway in fighting vampires. However, the story isn't quite finished, and I think this next part in the comic is pretty cool. We're brought to Santa Carla in 1987 to a specific scene in the original film. That was the scene where David and the other vampires brought Michael to show him what they really were. And they attack those people partying around the fire. In the comic book, though, we see the scene play out from the perspective of one of the partygoers by the name of Shane. During the attack, Shane was bit by David, but before David could kill him, one of the other vampires told David that Michael was gone and pointed up to the tree, which would have been around the time Michael fell from the tree in the first film. So Shane ends up surviving and wanders into the ocean where he gets attacked by a shark. However, he embraces what's happening to him and kills the shark and decides he wants to be a vampire. Even mentioning that David is his half-brother and his blood flows through his veins. Now, for those that don't know, Shane is the main vampire in the film Lost Boys the Tribe and is played by Angus Sutherland, who just so happens to be the half-brother of Kiefer Sutherland, who actually played David in the first Lost Boys film. So I thought this last scene was actually pretty cool. Alright, so that was Lost Boys, Reign of Frogs, the comic book miniseries for you. Now, like I said, I really enjoyed the comic books with the exception of issue number 4. I hate that they make Edgar Frog seem like a really terrible vampire hunter and basically just a fraud. Because I love the idea of Edgar and Alan, the Frog brothers, who are these awesome vampire hunters and slaying the undead like it's nothing to them. However, I guess it does fit with the character of Edgar Frog from the film Lost Boys the Thirst, because in there he basically seemed like he was a pretty terrible vampire hunter and didn't really know what he was doing. But other than that, I love these comics and I totally recommend picking them up. One of the things that make these comics so great is that they flow very nicely with the films. I mean, you can now go back and watch the original Lost Boys movie with these in mind and go, wow, I can see Grandpa being a half vampire. Wow, and you can start noticing all these little things, which makes it really awesome. So like I said, I totally recommend going and picking up the comics if you can find them cheap enough. You know, $4 to $5. If you can find them for that cheap, go ahead and pick them up. Totally great. I completely and totally recommend them. So whatever. That about wraps it up for me. I'm gonna head on out of here. So whatever. I'm Janitor Jake, and I'll see you guys next time.